And he gets on his bike and he drives in. And we know he drives in because he passes Donna Gorman's house. And Donna Gorman was an early witness from the state. And she did an identification of Zach Hughes from that witness stand. The state was not expecting that. We had never shown her a photo lineup. We had shown her a photo of the bike, of Zach on the bike from the ring cameras. But she had never seen Zach in person. And so we just left it. Now, we did wait until about 3 years after the murder before Donna Gorman told us that information. That is true. Riley Stokes talked to her that day, and he didn't have a copy of it. Master Deputy Wolf talked to her on the 19th, and he didn't show her a copy of the person on the bike. And so there was so much chaos going on, so many officers moving in so many directions, trying to find the evidence to solve this murder. It was just overlooked. And so when we went and talked to her, this was her testimony. And that's what we presented to this jury. She was right. She was right. The DNA proved it. Zach Hughes proved it. So Donna Gorman sees him, and she says this around 8:15-ish when he goes by. And then he goes to Christina Parcell's house. And my opinion is that he went and he hid under the bottom of the house. His testimony was different. He says different. He says that he got there and went straight in, dropped his bike, and went to the front door. We have a difference. Maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe I'm wrong. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. But I submit that he went and he waited. He had an hour to wait. Of course, he had an hour drive from the Mountain House all the way to Canebrake. You know what he could have done? He could have turned around. He could have done anything he wanted. He could have gone to the QT. He could have changed his mind. He had many opportunities to do that. He was committed. And so he went and he lied and he waited. And he waited for a time because he knew her schedule and he knew her car. He knew her address. That's in evidence. And he went and he decided to walk in the front door with roses as a ruse, according to his testimony, with a gun and a knife and a backpack, paint thinner so he could clean up afterwards, and he kills her. So let's see the moments before Christina Parcell is murdered. Zach Hughes, dressed as he said he was, gray sweatshirt, backpack, black pants, walks directly into that house. I can't see if he's carrying flowers. I know he was. I know he had flowers on him. And he walks in and he surprises Christina Parcell. Points a gun at her. Hits her in the head with the gun. And then he stabs. And he begins to stab. And he begins to slash. And he begins to slash. And he begins to stab. And stab and slash. Now think of the force needed to stab someone in the chest. Stabbed him in the back, all over the head. And finally, and through all the fighting and the stabbing and the pushing, while Christina is fighting for her life, he finds the vulnerable spots stabs her in the jugular and the carotid artery, causing her to bleed out. With blunt force trauma to the head, she has to be on the ground. Blood is everywhere, pulling around her dropped phone and the couch. But that's not enough. He drags her through her own blood to cover up the crime as he closes the curtains and locks the front door so he's not detected as droplets of blood fall from his blood-soaked clothes. She remains laying on that floor in her own blood with nothing but her blood-soaked scrubs and her wedding band that Brad Post gave her. But his sadistic actions are not over. I submit, ladies and gentlemen, those rose petals had a dual purpose. He may have used them as a ruse to get in and get inside the house so he could surprise Christina and gain that strategic advantage to murder her. But he also sprinkled them around. He sprinkled them around the house, on her purse, around, as some sort of sadistic, artistic sign that he thought was necessary. And then he had to keep in line with the allegations: prostitution and drugs. Put a bag of cocaine under a couch, or in a chair, right down from her body. Killing her wasn't enough. Shaming her was the goal, too. This was not to save Aida. This was to help John Mello win his custody case. He never told us about the drugs either. Never mentioned those. So then the cover-up. So then, after you effectuate the crime, you commit it, then you got to clean up. You got to cover up. So he first had to cover up the scene. He had to worry about that DNA under her fingers. That DNA is key to this case. He had to wipe her fingers down with that paint thinner. He did not want to get caught. Pre-planned, and then really good exit strategy, cover up. Then he went back to the mountain house. Of course, we know he's there because his phone puts him there around 1:17. He connects to the Wynn Wi-Fi. The Wynns have a mountain house. He has access to it. Remember, it's real remote. I think Master Deputy Wolf said it's so remote you could walk around naked. Nobody would see you. Perfect place to clean up a crime scene like that. Can you imagine how soaked in blood his clothes were? Can you imagine how soaked in blood his car was? Can you imagine how soaked in blood his bike was? And he did. And he admitted it. Burned his clothes, ditched the knife and the gun in some pond, cleaned up everything, and he went back to Tyndall about his daily life. And that's what he said. Now, I've mentioned Zach Hughes' testimony a lot. And I'm sorry that you had the unfortunate privilege of hearing the specific testimony of the killing of Christina Parcell by a cold-blooded, cold, stone-faced killer trying to portray himself as a hero instead of the cold-blooded, calculating killer that he actually is. Only a person with a severely diminished sense of heroism with a heart that is cold as ice can portray that. The absurdity of many of his words and I'll reference a couple. I wanted to make her death quick and painless. This is what he said. When I was listening to that, it was hard for me to comprehend that someone is actually saying that at their trial to a jury. Do we say thank you? I appreciate it. Thank you for taking my pain into consideration as you murder me? What does that even mean? Well, I ask you this. Was it quick and painless when he hit her in the head with a gun? Was it quick and painless when he stabbed her the first time? Was it quick and painless when he stabbed her the second time? How about the fifth, the 10th, maybe the 20th? He was being considerate. Maybe the 30th. How about the final 35th blow? And then, of course, I asked him one question. How'd you drag her body across the room? And he said, I don't really recall, but I think it was by her ankles. He looked me in the eyes in a stone cold faced way. Told me the answer. Like he was proud of it. He said, I do not want anyone else to be involved. I waited till everyone was gone. Thanks. Appreciate that. Talking like he's doing us a favor. I wonder what would happen if a neighbor did come over. I wonder what would happen if Brad Post had showed up. I wonder what would happen if Tina Parcell had showed up. Would it be a double homicide so we could escape and escape detection? And of course, he was so calculated, he got her schedule that day from John Mello. And then he said, I didn't want to get caught because they would connect me to John Mello. Oh, okay. So if you didn't get caught, you've solved the custody problem. But if I did get caught, then I didn't solve the custody problem because then they would connect me to John Mello and he wouldn't get custody. Then he comes in here, testifies, connects John Mello. Doesn't make any sense. Now, he talked a good bit about his background. My understanding, he's a fantastic pianist, highly trained. But he went through his resume with an ego, letting you all know how great he really was. Military service. Playing these really difficult sonatas by Beethoven. I'm going to play all 16, never been done. But he described his sister Grace in great detail as well, for some reason. He said she was a horrific person when confronted with irrefutable evidence. She would go cold, stone-faced. She would manipulate and recruit others to do a terrible deed. If you trust Grace, you're only going to get hurt again. She was a vampire and would suck the blood right out of you. Maybe he's describing himself. He said, I feel pity for her. He felt pity for Christina Parcell. How was that even possible of a human being? His heart is so mean, so depraved, that he viewed someone he'd never met and discussed the specific details of killing her, treating her like she was an elderly dog being sent to the vet to be euthanized. It doesn't get any meaner than that. Christina Parcell didn't have to die. Zach Hughes had a million opportunities to not do this. And if he did it to save Aida, there's a million ways to handle that. Vigilante justice is not allowed in this state. Vigilante justice isn't allowed anywhere. Regardless of what Zach Hughes had in his mind or what he thinks he had into his heart, he's lying to himself. Because all he had was hate and meanness, coldness. He brutally murdered Christina Parcell. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a long 2 weeks. I thank you for your service, and I thank you for listening to me. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. I'm going to ask you to go back there and deliberate. I'm going to ask you to find Zach Hughes guilty of harassment, of burglary, of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime, and murder. Thank you.
May I please report? Let me get a little bit of water. Okay. I want to start with something that Mr. Wilkins said towards the beginning of his comments to you. He said, Zach Hughes solved John Mello's problems. Yesterday, Zach Hughes told you he solved Aida Mello's problems. That's what he told you yesterday. Ladies and gentlemen, you got to watch the state. You got to watch the evidence. Zach Hughes yesterday came in here and told you under oath that he killed Christina Parcell on October the 13th, 2021. He told you that. But contrary to what Mr. Wilkins just told you, killing somebody in and of itself is not a crime. Mr. Wilkins told you that he confessed to committing the crime. That is not the case. Yesterday, Zach Hughes told you that he killed Christina Parcell, but in doing that, he did not tell you or confess to any crime. And let me be clear, and let me tell you why I say that. Every crime, and the judge is going to tell you this in the instructions, every crime has two parts in general terms. The actus reus, which is the action, and the mens rea, which is what's in your mind, the intent, that the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's very important that you understand this from the get-go. He did not confess to a crime yesterday. He confessed to killing Christina Parcell. But that in and of itself does not make him guilty of murder. That's very important. Okay? The first part of, or Mr. Wilkins had talked about how this case is unique. It is unique. And one of the unique parts about this case is that first part that I talked about, the actus reus, the action that's involved, there's very little dispute, if any. Zach admitted that he killed Christina Parcell, right? Where the dispute is, where the heart of this case is the evidence as to what was in Zach's heart, what was in Zach's mind, that the state must prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt. It must be evidence that leaves you firmly convinced. It must be evidence that would cause you not to hesitate to act. Right? That's what they have to do. So the heart of this whole case, Mr. Wilkinson can talk about the blood, he can talk about the scene, he can talk about all these things. But the heart of this case is the intent, is the mens rea. What have they proven about Zach's intent? All right? Now, let's talk more about what the judge is going to charge on the law and what they have to prove about intent, about the mental side of this. All right? Zach has been charged with murder. The state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt malice. That is the intent, the knowledge, the mental part of murder. The state must also prove burglary in the first degree, that when he entered that home, he intended to commit a crime. In this case, murder. He intended to commit the crime, which means there was a crime he committed. For harassment, the state must prove that he sent those mailers, which he admitted to doing. He sent those mailers without a legitimate purpose. And for the conspiracy, the state must prove that he formed an agreement to do something illegal. That is the mental component to this. And again, that's the heart of the case. And Mr. Wilkins, in his opening statement, said, we have to prove the state beyond a reasonable doubt an angry heart, that Zach was mad. That's where the heart of this case is. What was Zach thinking? What has the state been able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt about what was in his heart and what was in his mind? Now, you're going to hear, the judge is going to talk to you about different types of evidence you can consider. He's going to talk to you about circumstantial evidence, which is evidence that an arrangement of facts, when put together, that lead to other facts or conclusions. That's circumstantial evidence. Judge is also going to tell you about direct evidence. Direct evidence is evidence that comes from people who perceived what happened, who with their senses derive knowledge about what happened. All right? That is direct evidence. The state has the burden of proof on the mental element, and the state is going to use circumstantial evidence. That's what they're going to use. We have no burden of proof whatsoever. We entered and are going to use both direct evidence and circumstantial evidence to explain what Zach's state of mind was on October the 13th, 2021. Now, what is the state going to do to try to prove what was in here? To try to establish the burden of the mental side. Again, it's more than just the acts. That's critically important. But what's the state going to use to prove the mental component to this? They're going to use the acts, and they're going to say, they're going to use the stab wounds, the photos. They're going to use all the actions that Zach testified to yesterday. That in and of itself is not a crime. And in Mr. Wilkins, he talks about stab, and I wrote this down, stab, 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 slash, right? Gotta watch, gotta be careful, right? This is a tragic case. Bottom line, someone died. The last thing I ever want to do is minimize the tragedy in this case. Not gonna do it, all right? But when we come to talk to you about what happened, you have to have faith that what we are saying is balanced. Think about what Zach testified to and what Claire Rose testified to about Christina Parcell and what happened that day. Right? Stab, 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 slash, slash, slash. Claire Rose testified Christina Parcell was 163 pounds. Zach testified that he was 160 pounds. Claire Rose testified that there were, of the 35 wounds, the vast majority were incised wounds. Superficial wounds, wounds that would have been consistent with a struggle. Zach told you that when he went inside, there was a struggle. He told you that they fell to the floor. He told you that when he got inside, his body would not do what he was telling it to do because he didn't want to do it. He did not want to have to do it. So let's talk about the circumstantial evidence that the state has offered as evidence to try to get you to understand what was in Zach's mind. The state talks about, and in determining how much weight to give to their representations about their conclusions on the circumstantial evidence, just think about this. Donna Gorman testified that 3 years after this happened, having never been shown a photo lineup, with Zach's face all over the television and the internet, that she says that she saw Zach. Now, here's what is most troublesome about this whole thing. She testified that she saw Zach at 8:15. That's what she testified to. She testified she saw Zach through 2 trees in her house, that he was wearing a hoodie, no evidence other than what she said about a hoodie. In fact, Zach said that he was wearing a hat or a smaller hat. There is no way that she could have seen Zach Hughes at 8:15 because by the state's own evidence, with the ring cameras, with investigator Sparkman, the state's own evidence, Zach didn't even get there until after 9 o'clock. So when he says, Donna Gorman, she saw him, it's impossible that she saw him the way she said, because she said 8:15 by their own admission, by their own evidence. Zach didn't even get there until after 9 o'clock. Think about that. In determining how much weight to give to their spin on the circumstantial evidence, think about investigator Sparkman, all right? Called him as a witness and showed him reams of WhatsApp messages. These messages were garbled, but he had a unique skill. I don't know if he went to WhatsApp school, but he spoke fluent WhatsApp, right? And he was asked to decode all of these messages for you as though you couldn't have done it yourself. But what's the most interesting thing about what he said in the WhatsApp messages, there was one message that he was not able to decode, coincidentally. The message that had the words Aida and doomed. That was the only message he could not uncode for some reason. Think about that. In trying to determine how much weight to assign to the state's conclusions or their spin on the evidence, think about Vanessa Cormelo and what she testified to. Mr. Wilkins talked about how she was doing everything she could during this period to uncover it. Really interesting, and the judge is going to tell you this. You can determine or decide how much weight to give to testimony. You can give it a lot of weight, you can give it a little weight, you can give it no weight. I want you to think about how much weight to assign to the state's conclusions in that testimony, because I want to take you to one specific exchange between Jake Hofferth and Vanessa Cormello. Jake Hoffreth asked Ms. Cormello, prior to October the 13th, 2021, and he said this, and they've said this throughout this entire case, prior to the murder of Christina Parcell, which is for you to decide and you to decide alone. Prior to October 13th, 2021, did you have a recommendation as to where Aida Mello should live? In other words, would you have had a recommendation as to whether or not she lived with her mother? And what was Vanessa Cormello's answer to that? And you can hear this for yourself. At the time, I would have recommended the mom. At the time. There was no follow-up to talk about other times. Can you trust that evidence? Very important. That's the circumstantial evidence. Now, let's talk about the direct evidence that you received from Zach himself as to why he did what he did. He got on that stand, he told you. Let's talk about the direct evidence. He talked about what he knew. What he was told by John Mello. That was part of it. He talked about that. But contrary to what Mr. Wilkins said, he had a lot of other information besides just what John Mello told him. He had a deposition that Christina Parcell gave under oath in July of 2016. And you remember I asked him, after you read that deposition, what did you believe about Christina Parcell? What did you believe? He said he believed that she was engaged in prostitution. He said he believed that she had participated in a pornographic movie. He said that he believed that she had used drugs after reading that deposition. Another document that Zach got, Alex Field's affidavit. Now, this is very important to consider about this. This entire case, the state has worked very hard to distance Christina Parcell from the escort website. And they've made these conclusions just because they want to. Despite the fact that there are website addresses on those photographs, they have insisted that those photographs were private photographs, were taken by John Mello and then somehow put on the internet by John Mello, that she had nothing to do with that, right? Think about this. And this is an evidence for you to consider. The Alex Fields affidavit, it has one page on the front, which is what he said, that they met randomly at Hall's in 2018, that she propositioned him for sex and drugs in exchange for money. He turned that down. But in the second page of the affidavit for Alex Fields, John Mello, in that advertisement, said, if you know this woman, her name is Christina Parcell, and then he puts the Caroline Warren alias in that ad. Right? Here's the question for you to consider. If he didn't think that she really and truly went by Caroline Warren online, why would he put Caroline Warren's name in an ad for people to respond to? Why would he include that if he did not think that may trigger someone who had seen her site? Why would he do that? I would submit to you, he put her name on that ad because she was Caroline Warren, and he was hopeful that someone who had seen the ad or used the ad would recognize the picture and contact him. That's the only reason why that makes sense. Let's talk about the other evidence, and let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's just talk about it that Mr. Wilkins discussed. The planning, right? Let's talk about that. Zach was very honest when he testified about the planning. He told you in detail what he did. in a lot of cases, planning can be good evidence. In a lot of cases. As Mr. Wilkins said, this is a very unique case. And probably one of the most unique aspects about this case is that the person who Zach believed posed the danger was the mother to her own child. Think about that. This isn't where you're home and an intruder comes in, you don't know, and it's a spur of the moment. This isn't a random interaction or difficulty. This is what Zach believed. This is a mother, the person who's charged with caring for your child, most importantly. The person of all on the whole planet who is supposed to be the most nurturing. This is the person who is doing this to the child. The person who lives with the child, the evidence was the person who shared a room with the child, the person who's with the child all the time. So in a situation like that, where you have a belief that's grounded on documents, that's grounded on information shared with you over many, many months, when you have that belief, how do you alleviate that threat, the threat from the mom, without thinking through how to do it? How do you do that? And so I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the planning in this case, unlike most any other case, doesn't show malice because the mom was the threat. The mom was the one who posed the danger. Mr. Wilkins talked a lot about, this was just interjecting in the custody, just get John custody, get him custody, right? If this was all about the custody, why would Zach have waited so long to do it? Right? Part of it, he was in a process. Part of it, he was working on this music project. But the other part is, Aida and John were separated for half a year. Right? If Zach wanted to fix it to solve John's problem, he would have done it much sooner. But the reason why it took so long is that Zach agonized over it. What do I do? Over time, he continued to get information. What do I do? He didn't want to do it. If he wanted to do it, he would have done it right away. And he told you that when he testified. He told you in detail about that day. He told you about it. About when he woke up, he drove to that location and he thought he was going to throw up. He told you about his hand shaking. He told you about when he got out and got on his bike, it was one pedal in front of the other, just trying to make it there. He told you about this, and you saw him testify. He's, contrary to what Mr. Wilkins said, he doesn't think he's a hero. He's never asked that. He did what he believed he had to do to save an innocent child. That's what he did. That's why it's more than just the action. He hasn't confessed to any crime. He told you what he did. And he told you the truth about what he did. If Mr. Wilkins talked about solving John's problem, right? And he intimated in his closing that an aspiring or starving, I can't remember what word he used, pianist would turn down $10,000. Interesting. As though to say he didn't turn it down. There's no evidence anywhere that John Mello ever paid him a dime to do this. None. Gotta watch the state, ladies and gentlemen. lot of in the state's closing, lot of moral indignation. That, what do you mean try to be humane? Who can say that? How does that even mean, right? I was not in Zach's shoes. Nobody was in Zach's shoes but Zach. Nobody was. None of us has been in a circumstance where we have reason to believe an innocent child is being abused by her own mother, where her father is out of the country, the evidence is shown, with a warrant pending, can't come back. When you write an affidavit to try to put the authorities on notice as to what you believe is happening, when you call DSS and DSS does nothing, none of us have been presented with that circumstance. Mr. Wilkins said, we can't condone vigilante justice. That's what he said. He said, if you find him not guilty, I'm going to be out of a job. Right? It's really interesting. The state wants you to be a legislature and make decisions for the people of the state in law and order. But they don't want you to be a jury when it comes to deciding how the law applies to the facts. Because they just want you to assume he's already confessed to it, he's guilty of a crime. They use the word murder throughout, which is a legal phrase, which is an offense that you have to find. So they want you to speak for the people of the whole state, but they don't want you to really look at the evidence. And that's what we're asking for. That's just what we're asking for. Mr. Wilkins said he could have done other things. This didn't have to happen, okay? The judge will not instruct you that Zach Hughes had a burden to exhaust all remedies, to try everything he could to do. He tried a lot. He wrote the affidavit, went to DSS, did a lot of different things. But there's absolutely no requirement. We have no burden whatsoever. Just to continue to remind you that. We have no burden whatsoever. The burden is on the state. And there's no burden whatsoever for me as Zach Hughes' representative to try to prove to you that he exhausted every remedy. That's just not what the law says, and you don't need to prove. You don't need to even consider that. The evidence is that Zach tried. And when everything failed, that's when he acted to do what he thought was right, and that is, and was, to save Aida Mello. Ladies and gentlemen, the state talked about the mailers, and I don't envy your task. I don't at all. It's a tall task. But I do think the mailers, this piece of the case is a little bit easier for you to resolve, and let me tell you why. The judge is going to tell you that for it to be harassment, a couple things have to happen. First, the person who was the target of the harassment, in this case Christina Parcell, who's alleged in the indictment, the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she actually suffered mental distress, and that a reasonable person would have done so in that circumstance. But there has to be evidence that she actually suffered distress, mental distress. There is almost zero evidence that she actually experienced mental distress in this case, right? Let me talk more about that in specifics. There were at least 3 people who testified for the state who were with her when she gave the letters, those envelopes to law enforcement. At least 3 people. Brad Post, Dan Bevel, Mike Nicholson. Did any of those people testify that she was remotely upset? Any of those people say that she cried? Any of those people say that she was shaking? Any of those people say that she had made statements that led them to believe she was upset? Zero evidence. that shows, or that even comes close to proving, that Christina Parcell was upset. And if anything, the evidence you've seen that has been introduced with nude photos of Christina Parcell online, with Alex Fields' affidavit, I think the evidence shows took a lot to get her upset or be in mental distress. So I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, on the harassment charge, that's something that you could go to initially and think about that evidence, and based on your recollection of the evidence, if you find that there's no evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she was in mental distress, then that's your answer on that charge right there. It's the state's burden of proof on each and every element. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, the state has brought us here. And they've brought the charges that you are to consider. They've decided what to charge, and they have brought us here on these specific charges. And the charge they brought, specifically the charge of murder, is among the most serious charges there is. Doesn't get any more serious than that. Murder, the charge of murder, in contrast to what the state's position is, requires more than the act of killing another person. It requires malice. Malice is defined, and the judge is going to define this for you, as evil, as hatred. In his opening statement, Mr. Wilkins told you an angry heart, mad. Ladies and gentlemen, I would submit to you that the evidence in this case has failed to show you that you should be firmly convinced you can be shown pictures and talked all about the acts. But when it comes to what he was thinking, what the evidence shows that was in his heart, that evidence hasn't come close. Ladies and gentlemen, in hindsight, 3 years after this happened, it's very fair for you to say this didn't happen, or this didn't have to happen, or disagree, I wouldn't have done that. Some of you may say you would have, some of you may say you wouldn't. That's fair. Bottom line. Can't say otherwise. But no matter what your take on what he did, I think it's so important that we rely on your common sense. And that was one of the things that Mr. Wilkins talked about early on, that how important your common sense is that you bring with you. And so in closing, I'm going to ask that you use your common sense that you brought with you to the courthouse and just ask yourself, does a person who kills another person with the intent to save an innocent child, does that person have evil in their heart? Does that person have an angry heart? Ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest to you that your common sense would tell you no. And that person who killed another to save an innocent child is not a murderer. I would ask that you return a not guilty verdict. Thank you very much.
Please, the court. Now the state has an opportunity to rebut, and I promise you, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be brief, so y'all can get to your deliberations. I do want to address a couple of issues. I want to make very clear, in this record, there is zero evidence of any kind of abuse. Not from a witness, not from any evidence. Mr. Mormon said you got to have some emotional distress from the harassment charges. Christina Parcell had a bunch of neighbors receive pictures of her without clothes on. Private photos between her and John Mello. And so what did she do? Immediately, Brad Post corralled them all up, took some from neighbors so they didn't see them, and she went to the police. Going to the police without emotional distress is not something that you see very often. Mr. Mormon talked about not trying to minimize this case. Minimize the killing of Christina Parcell. Minimizing the heinousness of this crime while trying to impugn her character. He talked about malice, and he said that you got to have an angry heart. He kept referring to me. I said, an angry heart. Malice, if you're mad at somebody. And I'll leave you with this. Ladies and gentlemen, in regards to an angry heart, just because Zachary Hughes' heart is so cold and so dead that it can't be angry, that is not a defense. You prove it by his actions. Thank you.
Members of the jury, it is now my duty as the trial judge to instruct you on the law applicable to this case. And in that regard, it is your duty as jurors to accept and apply the law as I now state to you. Furthermore, it is your exclusive duty to decide all the issues of fact in this case and determine the effect, the value, the weight, and the truth of the evidence. All the parties have the right to expect that you will carefully consider and evaluate the evidence and apply the law of the case to it so that in the end, all parties will receive a fair and an impartial trial. I remind you that during this trial, you and I have certain duties to perform. As the trial judge, it is my responsibility to preside over the trial of this case, and I also have the duty to rule on the admissibility of the evidence offered during this trial. You are to consider only the competent evidence before you. If there was any testimony ordered stricken from the record during this trial, you must disregard that testimony. And furthermore, you should not even mention or discuss any testimony that I'm instructed you to disregard in the deliberation room. You are to consider only the testimony which has been presented from this witness stand, any exhibits which have been made a part of the record in this case, and any stipulations of counsel. I have the additional duty to charge you the law applicable to this case. As the presiding judge, I am the sole judge of the law of this case, and it is your duty as jurors to accept and apply the law as I now state it to you. If you already have any idea as to what the law is or what the law ought to be, and it does not agree with what I now tell you the law is, you must abandon this idea because you are sworn